everybody. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's MassBio Forum, where we will discuss life after the incubator. My name is Danielle Bogdanowicz. I'm Vice President of Business Operations and Strategy at Biolabs. Biolabs is a global operator of co-working lab and office space for early-stage biotech companies. We aim to provide companies with capital-efficient lab infrastructure as well as equipment, access to educational programming and networking opportunities, as well as introduction to industry connections. So really looking forward to today's discussion. Just a little bit more about Biolabs. We're headquartered here in Cambridge. We also have 3 locations in the Boston area and a growing number of locations across the US and in Europe. So today we're going to be talking with these fine panelists here about their experiences and guidance for companies that are thinking about and moving towards exiting the incubator space and finding their own locations. So we'll start with some introductions. Kyle, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank MassBio and Emily for putting on this event. There's a lot of familiar faces out here, and I'm happy to see most of you. And those that I don't know, I look forward to meeting you in the future. So I'm Kyle. I'm the CEO of Venture Forward Partners. We're a company that supports early-stage life science companies in all things operations. So from project management, lab design, to relocations services, and also laboratory support services. So managing your day-to-day operations and all of the different things that you need on a day-to-day basis to make sure your operations run smoothly and efficiently.
Great, thanks. Reggie?
All right, so Dr. Reginald Swift, founder, CEO of Rubis Life Sciences. We are a clinical research organization devoted to designing trials as well as being able to launch trials as an emancipatory format where we want to bring in diversity patients in our own clinics to be able to support that whole ecosystem and the continuum of clinical research. So our focus is to be that one-stop shop for people of color in underserved and unsupported areas. So we are in Lawrence. We do have a number of different labs. We'll talk more about it here. But we also are growing. We are in a number of different cities so far. We are in 3 in Africa. So we're starting to try to expand and do more.
Great, now John.
Hey everybody, I'm John Weaver with Massachusetts Biomedical Initiatives, MBI. We are here to support the Reggies of the world. So MBI is the state's longest running biotech incubator. We're located in 3 sites around the city of Worcester. We've been around since 1984. And our goal is to help early stage startups go from concept to clinical trials as fast as possible in our private lab facilities that we have in the city of Worcester. So in addition to that, as a nonprofit, we're also very involved in coordinating kind of the workforce development and economic development efforts throughout central Massachusetts. So.
Great. All right, thanks everybody. All right, so to get started, before we talk about leaving the incubator, I think it'd be really helpful for folks to hear about, what stage are companies typically at, or what stage was your company at, Reggie, when you were in the incubator, and what did you find sort of the biggest value adds that space provided the team at that time?
Of course. So I guess the size of the company we were at the time, we were only 2 people. It was just myself and one other person. Only because of the acceleration of what we were doing in the federal space, we actually had to leave pretty quickly. So we were only there for, I guess, a year and some change. However, when we saw the benefit of the incubator space is that with 2 people, we all had centralized resources, from containers to any resource that you're going to need, assays, reagents, things of that nature. So it was helpful to have a one-stop shop in one location to be able to source all that. Now that we had to move away because of federal clearances that we needed to obtain, now we're doing it ourselves. So they don't tell you that you have to be that point person yourself to kind of coordinate it all. So that's one thing I do miss. I miss Sherry a lot. So she was our helpful guide in putting that together. But it was a choppy process for us. And if there was one thing I would have to share to other startups, small businesses as well, is that prepare for that knee-jerk reaction once you leave.
And how about you, John, from the MBI perspective?
Sure. Well, the first thing I guess I'd say is for the landlords in the room, like cover your ears for a second here. But the first thing I'd tell you is just stay in the incubator as long as you can. And I think a lot of the incubators, MBI is doing this, Lab Central is doing this, I know a lot of the other groups are doing this, are trying to stay longer in your life cycle because we've seen the challenges that you can run into as you're leaving the incubator. So MBI is about to open up a pilot manufacturing center. The goal of that is to try to help companies all the way through the early clinical trial process, just because we've seen the failures that you guys often go through when you go to leave it. So take as many of the resources of the incubator for as long as you possibly can. And largely it's because, in my mind, the incubator model is giving you like lab as a service. And the real estate community is often looking at this as an asset that you need to buy into and have for a long period of time, and you're going to make that investment to stay in that space. You guys are focused on data. And for you at the early stage, the space is really just a tool that you need to get data. So take advantage of the incubator network as long as you possibly can. And then companies typically go to leave that incubator and are successful in doing that when they get to a point where they have made that major round, their headcount's going to get beyond the space that the incubator can support, and they have some relative understanding of what their space needs are going to be for an extended period of time. So when you're at that point and you're ready for that point, that's where the conversation kicks in. But before that, take advantage of real estate as a service as long as you possibly can. So.
Great, thanks. And so I know, Reggie, you mentioned your company, the reason for leaving, around federal regulation and things like that for the company. Beyond that, John, from your experience, what are other reasons why, or what's sort of the impetus for companies deciding that it is finally time? Yeah. We want to stay at the incubator forever, but ultimately we can't. What are those reasons usually?
Yeah, so in our camp, and I'm sure it's similar across the kind of competitive incubator landscape, but MBI has early stage concept space where you can come in and test your idea. Our whole model is based around private labs. Then you move from what we call our startup center, that concept space, down to our scale-up center, about 1,000 square foot lab office modules, again, your own private dedicated space. And then you can shift into the pilot manufacturing center, stay a little bit longer. But ultimately what happens in our ecosystem, at least, is companies get to the point of about 10 to 15, maybe pushing 20 companies, or 20 employees, excuse me, and then they're reaching the point where it's too tight. The incubator model doesn't fit anymore. And that's typically the biggest driver that we see is based around headcount. You just get to the point where you have too much headcount to be able to support that within the incubator system. And that's usually when it's about the right time to start looking at space and putting the right team around you to help you get that to that next stage.
Great. And in terms of what the options are for folks, what are those space options look like? What should people be considering in terms of deciding between something like a grad lab or a spec lab or a sublease? Anybody?
Yeah, so I believe that would be really in regard to the infrastructure that you need. So it's your equipment, it's the headcount, it's what you're growing to, right? So one of the first things that we always do when we come into a new company or a new client is we take a look at that equipment matrix. It's first and foremost going to give you a great understanding of what the facility requires, what different types of lab you require, what kind of footprint you require, and any of the infrastructure needs as well, which is a big factor in what you look at when you're deciding where to go and what to do next. And so understanding your equipment matrix is one of the most important things that you can do as you start to look at new spaces and really come out of that incubator and work for whatever is on the table for you next, right? Whether it's a sublease space, which there's a lot of out there on the market right now, and there's a lot of great opportunities for that. Whether you're going to go out and design and build your own space, sometimes if you have specific scientific requirements, it's an absolute necessity. You have to go design your workflow to be efficient and make it sure it works appropriately. And then there's also opportunities like expanding into larger incubator spaces or just looking out there in general for any other opportunities that may occur. But that's kind of how I would see a different factor other than headcount of looking at what your requirements are to get into a new facility.
Reggie, can you speak a little bit to the path that you went on in terms of thinking, and your team went on in terms of thinking about space, how much space you need, also whether you were going to build out facilities or look for a spec lab or some sort of sublease someplace?
No, of course. So initially, I started in an office setting, right, where it was just myself, 300 square feet and 4 walls, right, and maybe some rats. But
For testing or?
They were neighborhood friends. But the way that we were thinking, because we knew that we were, a lot of our funding came from the government. So what we were focused on is, were there going to be able to be hindrances from, working with subleases, working with, build to spec labs, or even just like incubator spaces that could actually facilitate some of those requirements. And because that we went to the COR, right, the contracting officer on record, it ruled out a lot of the incubator spaces that we actually named, but there was a few that actually helped us. They kept on the list so that we went to those specifically directly. One of them was actually J Labs. So we went there directly. So we felt like, they can build to our order, right, and be able to kind of help us grow as we see fit, right. So we initially thought that, okay, maybe we're going to need a 500 square foot lab space. We're not going to need as much activity. 500 one week actually turned into 700 the next week, and then it turned into 2,000, a month later, and then it turned into 5,000 another month later, and then it turned into 6,500 another month later. So we grew pretty rapidly. It was just got to a point where it just couldn't be accommodated. So we actually had to kind of look outside. Within like 8 months, we had to start looking outside. But even though we're maintaining our operations within the lab, we had to kind of now look at other facilities. And because new requirements that were coming down, where we're going to require facility clearance, we actually had to kind of build our own space. So now, finding those types of people that are specialized in that area, you can actually maybe count them on two hands in the country, right? So that was already an undertaking in itself. So it's those specialty types that, even if I were to mimic that again, I probably would look at those resources beforehand or build up like a library of those types of resources. So like if an incubator would have those types of resources available to those types of organizations who are in those incubator spaces, I mean, it would be immensely valuable.
Right. And how much time, so it sounds like there was a rush to get into the new space, but how much time did it end up ultimately taking you to go from the incubator space to the build out?
So to the build out, it took us, we were in the incubator space for about a year and some change. I think it was close to like 7 months. And to actually get into, because we had a gap, of about 6 months. So it took us about 2.5 years to actually get into the build out space. And then we actually had to have the contractor on record build fast, build quickly. Right, and it was on the government's dime, so it really, it was like, just do it, right? Just do it, just get it done. So for us, luckily it didn't come in our pockets, but for us to facilitate the actual contract requirements, because it helped us really then accelerate our innovation around how do we look at specific types of products to go into different markets with, right? So the way that we looked at it, it was that when we saw that gap, it allowed us to strategize. In that interim, right? To be able to look at, okay, what's going to be happening in the next 5 years? Could I, have a plan where I can have alternates in a commercial space and make it commercially viable as well? So that helped us now realize, we can then still continue to use J Labs in a commercial viability. So we can translate what we're doing in the federal government into the commercial sector. So now we're expanding in that area as well. So now we're looking to partners with everybody here on the board, and maybe one of you guys here too, and help us grow in gateway cities.
Great, thanks. And so back to, I think, Kyle, when you were touching on the different types of spaces folks can move into, is there a magic amount of time that folks should start thinking in advance for each of those various options?
Yes, so the time is always shifting. If I were to have this conversation last year, I would have told you it's a year and a half out till you can get your own space. That's not necessarily the case anymore. With all of the sublease coming on the market, with all of the building that's been happening over the last 2-3 years, there's opportunity out there for you to move into a space at a much more rapid pace than what was previously thought. So if you're going to look and build your own space right now, you're probably looking at a good 12 months of design, build, construction, all of that. So definitely start looking about a year and a half in advance of when you're trying to get into that space at a minimum.
That was before COVID.
Yeah. So it's definitely it's improved over the last couple of years and months with all of the supply chain issues. We've been able to get all of the electrical panels per se back in stock. A lot of the other equipment that's been back ordered for months and months at a time. It's all kind of coming back. So it's a much faster process to get into your space now, and there's also space available in the market. If you're looking for a sublease space, those spaces are going to be somewhat move-in ready, so your biggest concerns are going to be your equipment, right? When can you get your equipment into that space? When can you get it plugged in and set up and get going? All your furniture is going to be taken care of. There's already going to be coffee and internet set up, so there's no worries in that regard to a sublease space. And so looking at your lead times, talking to your partners like Fisher Scientific in terms of the equipment that you're going to require, your biosafety cabinets, your freezers, all of those different aspects are really going to be your driving factor in terms of getting into that facility. And not to not mention your permits and licenses as well. So permits and licenses are going to be your other factor on top of that, which is going to be 3-4 months specifically if you need an MWRA permit. So just looking at all of those small, minute details as you start to identify these spaces, and you have to just think back through that timeline and what it's going to entail to get you in and get you operational and what your team is going to require. And if you have all of those details pulled together, it's going to help you exponentially in getting into that space as quickly as humanly possible. And so those are just a couple of the factors that you can look at. There's a million more out there that you need to think about as you're going into a relocation and getting your vendors created and getting your credit application submitted, all of those different factors if you don't have it on board yet. But I would say 3 months at a minimum if you're going into an already built space is going to be a very tight timeline to get you in. 6 months is going to give you a good amount of runway, and anything past 6 months, if you're not doing a build out and you don't have to do any modifications to the space, you're going to be in the clear in pulling that together.
Just add a couple points to it as well. The first one is add into that timeline period of time to build the team around you. One of the things that you're spoiled rotten with in incubator settings is that you have this team around you, this support system where there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't have to think about. And when you get out and you have to start now managing your own space, all of these functions now have to be accounted for. So take some time to build that team around you that can support you through the construction, the negotiation of the lease. There's going to be a whole bunch of terms that you're not going to be familiar with because you've been so, you've had such an easy scenario in the incubator that you didn't have to worry about this stuff. So put that team around you. The other point to make too is that this is an interesting time in the market cycle. So 2 years ago there was capital everywhere and a ton of companies going in, and space was at a premium. You couldn't find 1,000 square feet of space anywhere. Today there's less capital in the market, but there's more sublease space available. So you can use that to your advantage to extend your runway during this type of period and get a sublease that might be advantageous to you for a long period of time. But you have to think ahead about that as well and think that both of those things might at some point normalize. More capital will hopefully start flowing into the market. But on the flip side, when that happens, that sublease space and that other space that you're looking for, that next space you're looking for might get more competitive. So if you're looking at a sublease now and there's 9, 12 months of term, 18 months of term left on it, you should be thinking now about negotiating the extension on that to make sure that your carpet doesn't get pulled out from under you a year from now when that sublease goes to renew. So just keep in mind that where we are today, where we sit today, is kind of a unique period in time, and you should always be planning for kind of that return to the median. So.
Interesting, thanks. And so you touched on teams, John. How, I guess, in terms of what you've seen from the various companies leaving your spaces and also in your experience, Reggie, how do folks evolve their teams to prepare for these kinds of moves in terms of additional staffing or, hiring consultants or part-time folks to support the new needs they have?
Well, call Kyle, for one. So our, within our incubator model, first of all, we're their facilities team. We're their operations team. We manage their front desk. There's so many functions that we serve for those early stage companies that once they leave, they're like, oh man, I didn't think about that. And they usually love us the most like the 6 months after they leave, because they're like, holy cow, I took you guys totally for granted. But so just think about all those functions that the incubator is serving for you, and make sure that you have the support. I also think as you think about teams, there's a whole group of consultants you're going to want to put around you. Some of them in the room, but make sure you have a really good broker that you trust, that's going to represent your long-term interest and is going to want not just the lease you're doing now, but the next 3-4 leases you're doing, so that they respect you and they represent you in a way that supports your long-term goals. Make sure you're putting the lab operations team around you, because that's going to be a whole new function for you that you're going to have to start thinking about, how you're going to run that lab, how you're going to set it up. We always use an owner's project manager to manage our construction, and that's largely just to make sure that the contractors speak a different language, certainly a different language than scientists. So make sure that you have people that can speak that language and can support you through that process. Health and safety, a lot of times that's a function that's supported within the incubator environment. You're now going to have to figure out how you internalize that and bring it on board. So you really got to think through your day-to-day operations and what functions that right now are being supported by other people, and kind of what additional tasks are coming up that you can't, you have to respect, and you have to put the team around you that can kind of help you navigate through that.
I could definitely echo those sentiments. I failed up, right, finding the right people. So honestly, the first time I was leaving the space to build out the federal lab, I just used one consultant. That was a mistake, big one. But what I realized is after that is that it was actually, I was here in Cambridge. I was just going for coffee, just as you find a chance meeting. There was a health and safety consultant contractor that was sitting right there as well, and because I saw his vest, so I was asking some questions, and then I brought him on as a consultant, and then he started helping me frame out everything that I would look at, right, whatever need. So he helped me really think through, how do I build out the team that I'm actually going to need. So I ran into another Kyle. It wasn't him, unfortunately, but I did run into another Kyle, and he actually put that team together for me to help consolidate the project management for the whole build out. So that was an alleviation, because he had teams to work with the city planning, work with the environmental groups as well, to make sure that we had the certification for those as well. Electrical panel and everything else for safety. OSHA as well. Those are other considerations that you got to talk to on an ongoing basis, right? I mean, if you thought my email was crazy now, back then it was just like, I'll get back to you in 6 months, right? I'll find a way, right, to talk to you. But it wasn't going to be tomorrow, right? But realizing that a lot of the onus will be on you, and essentially, like, I went from, as soon as we left the incubator space, we went from like 12 people, and I was managing now, 200, right, with the contractors, right? That's including contractors. So then I'm like, my gosh, my head, I'm about to lose more hair, right, on my head. So then I brought in an operations specialist, right, to help us with the company. And then they started helping facilitate a lot of that conversation. But, there were a lot of sleepless nights, right, in the beginning. But we got to a place where it was normalized, and we finally got to end, and we were able to launch the lab. So, here I am today with more hair.
Well, to that point as well, you have a full-time job that is not moving you out of that facility, designing, building a full lab, getting that all set up. Your job is to run the company, and that's the same for all of your scientists as well. They're supposed to focus on the science, and so having that support team around you really allows them to continue that work that they're doing in the labs and making sure that it's moving forward appropriately, while you're making sure that everything else is being taken care of on the back end from the operational perspective. To your point, John, operations in an incubator is seamless. And one of the funniest stories I've had is I was talking to somebody in the incubator, and they had no idea where the CO2 came from. It just showed up every day, right? And they didn't have to change the tanks. They didn't have to do anything like that. And those are some of the smaller things that you don't think about when you get into your own facility, is how all of these things actually worked, right? There's so many intricacies in running a lab and making sure that the lights come on and the power stays on, and is your emergency generator going to kick on if everything goes out and you're going to lose all your samples or what? So just looking at all of those different factors and really thinking through that process and making sure that you have somebody in your back pocket that has gone through it and understands those different factors, at least off the start, so you can know that you're moving in the correct direction is very important, I would say. And we've seen it 9 times out of 10 where we come in after the fact, and it's just an interesting process to try to catch up and make everything kind of whole again.
And how do you think about, so with all those, team members and specialties you need, how do you go about thinking about who is good to hire full-time and needs to be a permanent part of your team going forward versus the folks you may just need for the move or for some period of time till your operations are starting? How do companies think about that?
I'll start with that. For me, we look at things in 5-year increments. So for me, I always think about a strategist, right? A facilities strategist, and I actually brought him on full time because he now understands what we're trying to do, from state to state, from city to city, state to state, and where we want to be in 15 years, right? If we get bought out first, right? But he understands kind of our plan, and it's his job to find, a Kyle, find a John, and find everybody else that we're gonna need to move forward in the direction that we're looking for. So for me, now that headache is not on me anymore, right? It's someone else to manage, and I don't have to worry about the CO2 tank or the oxygen lines that are out for one day, where everybody's running like their hair's on fire, right? It's being able to now have that one person, be that designated point of contact, and it's really, honestly, it's probably one of the best investments if you're thinking about expansion beyond Incubator to build your own space, and even in the sublease, containment. That's probably one of the best investments you're ever going to make as far as your growth.
Yeah, and to add to that, right? So when hiring full-time employees, first off, it's added headcount. It takes away from your scientific staff that you can bring, specifically on the G&A side. But that's one factor that we look at in depth, right? There's a stage in which you'll probably need somebody quite a bit if you're designing and building a space. And then once you move into that space, it's going to slow down, and they're not necessarily going to have a full-time job anymore. And so where does that come into play, right? How do you look at that? How do you outsource those factors? Or how do you make sure that they have a full-time job after you've completed all of this project, all of these different things, and you're managing a lab, say 20, 30,000 square feet, you have 20 scientists working day to day. Does that really entail kind of that full-time lab manager operations position? Not necessarily. It can, but it doesn't necessarily need to. So that's just one factor that we look at in terms of just how our services can be provided. I'd say early on, you're definitely looking at having at least some administrative staff on board because they can coordinate all of those different factors and making sure that all the vendors are pulled together in different aspects like that. But from a lab manager, lab operations standpoint, you just got to look at where you're going, what that 5-year runway is, and the amount of space and work that you're going to have actually going on within that laboratory after it's built out and operational.
The only thing I would kind of add to all that too is to layer it in with the conversation we had earlier around timeline. The right time to start thinking about this stuff is before you do your capital round. So you're making sure that you're factoring in the bandwidth that you're going to need to be able to operate the staff, both full-time and part-time, that you're going to need. So, if you're thinking about going for that next round, and that next round includes an expansion beyond the incubator, it's a good time while you're doing that fundraising process to start having some conversations with the Kyles of the world to try to plan ahead for what that head count's going to look like. Bear in mind the construction's always going to cost more than you think it's going to take longer than you think it's going to. Putting in some of these contingencies to make sure that you're generating enough capital to be able to get yourself through to that next piece, because you're on the flip side of that, signing that lease, you're really now switching from having lab as a service to now that lease is a kind of financial instrument that your landlord's looking at as a commodity, and they're going to expect you to honor that and maintain that, and it's just a different environment. You can't flex down the way you might have in an incubator if things get tight. So you really just want to be thinking early on about how you put this plan together and making sure that you're factoring that in as you're going to raise capital to support all this as well.
Yeah, no, so just to add one more thing behind that, I've never heard of a 99-year lease ever. So this was kind of my first time ever hearing something like that. I mean, I'm gonna be dead before my lease expires, right? So, or maybe I will be very old, in case regeneration happens, right? But it's something that you have to build into kind of as the asset of the company as well, right? Look at as real estate as the asset for the company, not just as a liability, right? So for us is that now we get to maneuver much more than we can from our own space because it's ours now, right? Not so much in an incubator, not so much in a build out lease, sublease, where you may have some restrictions, but in our own. But it also, we were laughing earlier about, it costs more, right? For this whole build out, we went 30% over from the initial build out, right? From the initial tentative costs. We didn't think that we were going to ever spend, close to what we did on all of that. So, but then it's like, you got to look at those specific, strategic points as to what you're actually expecting to achieve from your milestone for your organization and why you need the space that you do, right? Could you extend your runway into being an incubator while you're achieving those milestones as well, right? Looking at those capacities as well. So, just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, great. And then in terms of any other resources, I know we keep saying Kyle's a valuable resource, but any other additional resources either that you are grateful you had during the build-out process or you see companies leveraging, John, or alternatively resources that you still think the ecosystem could benefit from that don't yet exist?
It's a good question. I think we've covered a lot of it. I think put that support team around you that's going to serve all those different functions that you're going to need up front. I do think having a good broker that you respect and work with is just one thing I wanted to touch on a little bit more here because there's going to get in the incubator. You can think about real estate in a 2-month, 3-month kind of conduit or timeline. As you start to get out to the private market, now you have to think about option terms and how long of a lease to sign, and does that obligate you to more of a commitment than you can handle? Or are you now held into a space that's limiting your growth? So making sure that you have that right broker partner that you respect and trust and that knows the life sciences ecosystem well, I think is a key piece, just to make sure you don't get stranded. Outside of that, I think we covered most all of the other resources to add to that.
Yeah, so broker is absolutely important in terms of selecting your space, understanding the space that you're going into, who are you looking at, what floor are you on, what landlord do you have. All of these factors come into play, and there's a million factors to understand if that space is right for you. And your broker, if they're doing their job correctly, is going to get you into that space appropriately. And if they can do that, that's going to make the project team, their lives much easier, which comes into play with your construction manager, your architect, your engineer, all of these other factors when you're actually building the space. That group, you're going to be close, you're going to work with them, you're going to have at least one meeting a week, you're going to be on calls constantly with those crew. And so selecting that correct construction manager and architect is a very important factor in terms of when you're building your own space in that design, because if a project goes awry, it's not fun. And as long as you have a great working relationship with those members, it's going to make your lives a whole lot easier. So that's the projects team. And then I would look at the second factor, which is the operations team, right? So after you're moving into the space is all built out, you need all of these vendors to supply all of the things that you're going to need to operate within that space. You need your gases, you need safety, you need your consumables and your equipment and pest control and all of these other factors that come into play, that they're the most important people. They're going to be there on a day-to-day. They're going to support you. They're going to make sure that everything is taken care of for you, that you're getting your stuff on time. And that's one thing that MassBio is great with as well. They have so many great vendors under their umbrella that just have wonderful relationships with all of these companies, and we can take it from there. So those are the two major teams that I would see that come into play as you're moving out of an incubator, building your own space, and getting into it and handling your own operations from a daily basis.
And the only thing to add to that is this is not a time to use that old friend of your mom's. Think about each of these consultants that you're bringing on as, as if somebody you're adding to your scientific team, and kind of investigate them with that level of kind of diligence to make sure you're getting someone who has that real life sciences knowledge, because life sciences in particular is a very unique segment of the market, and not everybody has that understanding.
Yeah, thanks. And then, so for Reggie, one more question around teams. We've touched a lot on what it takes to build the right team to keep everyone productive. From your experience, what were any challenges, or what did you do to help keep your team focused and driving toward the company mission during a time when there's, lots of change happening?
Very good question. A lot of what we practiced was more decentralized lab management or lab resourcing. So once COVID hit, we started looking into other spaces that could accommodate, our short-term needs, right? And because a lot of people had to go into the lab, and we had a lot of project managers that didn't need to really go into the lab, so we had to kind of change the dynamic of how we engage our own internal resources, right, to be able to be supplied, and at least go into specific labs. So, we use like a technical approach where we look at labs closer to some of our employees' homes or closer to their location, so that they, we create a relationship with them, and we started looking into ways on being dynamic in that approach. Right, they actually found it to be very flexible, where if they wanted to take time to go home and care for their kids or their loved ones, whatever they can, but also it's really close, right? And it's the ability to also have that negotiating power, right? To also be flexible and say, during this pandemic emergency response, people were solely now collaborative, right? We'll help you with whatever you need, however you need it, whenever you need it. And it was grateful to see that. And we're starting to see much more of those types of team dynamics that are starting to be matured and matriculated. And for us, it really took 2 project managers, our operations officer, and a few people with and gallons of coffee, right, to manage these guys from an ongoing basis, right? Because we're managing multiple locations, even though it may not be owned by us. We're still trying to coordinate with the lab managers of those locations so that we can make sure that they have what they're needing, and we can also facilitate communication and confidential resources that we needed to send their way, right? So it was that flexibility that we saw. Challenging at first, but then we found a streamlined process to get it done.
And I think you mentioned too, you still have a small footprint at the incubator while you operate other.
Yes, we do. We do. So
activities.
we still are with J Labs on a commercial sense. So we are connecting. So it's great to see now the framework, and we did lift some of the resource networks from what they have available, and it's really giving us some clarity as far as like if we want to start commercializing into the industry. Now they're helping us with that runway, right? That roadmap. So when we do our raise in that fashion, as John put it, we are looking now at like an 18-month window, right? So if so 18 months from now, we're looking to raise, then we're going to start planning for those resources that we're going to need from a facility standpoint. So it's going to allow us to say, do we expand to a bigger space in an incubator, or do we have to go into a sublease, or do we do another build out? I probably wouldn't recommend the build out, but I would probably do maybe a sublease, but maybe definitely extend my tenancy in an incubator for as long as possible. But we're realizing that from the incubator, the most valuable commodity that they have is people. It's the connections that they're building, right? And honestly, it's really a benchmark and really a platform where you can just lift from there, right? They're going to follow you. Their resources are going to follow you wherever you go. It doesn't matter. But it's really how you get connected to what resources you need at the really specific times that you need it. They're not trying to be competitive or trying to, mitigate your reach. It's just really however you exercise that negotiating power.
Yeah, and for you, John, as well, to what extent do companies come to you when they're, or to the team, when they're thinking about next steps, either to, keep one foot in the door as long as they can, continue to leverage those resources, or get your assistance?
Yeah, and I don't, I'll tell you how we do it, but I'd tell you not everybody does it this way, so be a little careful with this advice. But at MBI, like, we want you to come to us as early as possible. We want you to come and tell us that you're thinking about graduating, because I want to have the opportunity to influence the support team around you to make sure that you're successful beyond. You know, our feeling is we've invested so much into your early success that we want to make sure you don't get to a point that you crater that because you made a decision before you were ready. So my advice with our companies is come to us as early as possible, have the conversation. We'll put the support team around you, make sure that you're successful in launching out and doing that. And our philosophy internally is really it's all about team. And successful startups, your science, and this is hard for people to hear sometimes, but like your science is part of it, but it's really the commodity that you're working with. Management teams are really what makes startups successful, and having really good management teams. So as you now get into a new environment where you're not going to have you have this other component that you now need to manage, you just have to think about how your management team is going to grow as you expand on, because you're going to need to now occupy the space, but then you're going to need to fill the space. So you need the HR talent to be able to bring in the rest of your team and be able to handle a whole bunch of growth challenges all at once. So be thinking about that and build out your management team. The last quick plug I would make is, this is a time I think that you can think regionally as well, and this is my Central Mass chill. But what's happening in Boston and Cambridge is miraculous, and what's happening here. But a lot of the talent is now moving west. So if you're getting into a situation where you feel like you're going to get over leveraged on space by trying to be in one single zip code or geography, just take a wider lens and see if maybe I can compete better, and if my startup can compete better by being in a different zip code or region where you might have a lower rent and the same access to talent, but at a lower price point, that will help you maintain your startup longer term. Because we see how much you guys invest in these companies and how much you invest in getting this going, and that this is your American dream and your baby that you're taking over the finish line. Just make sure you're taking a holistic view about where you're locating that future, and making sure that it meets your startup's long-term goals. So.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I'll echo from the biolabs perspective. I think from an incubator side of things, we of course want to be a part of those discussions as early as possible as well, to support companies in their transition. So yeah, thanks for that. All right, great. So I want to open it up to the audience to ask if there's any questions. I'm happy to run with a microphone or repeat you if you're close. You got one?
Hi, my name is Jess Bakari. I have a question. When you were chatting a little bit about finding the right team, what are some of the qualities that you've looked for or your clients have looked for in finding the right architect or the right CM? And what are some qualities that you think could be pitfalls? And how do you advise your clients on how to pick their team?
I can take that one. So it's a great question. The market has changed quite a bit recently, and with just the massive amounts of space coming online, all of this construction coming online, there used to be, the top 5 different construction managers or different architects out there that, were lab planners. All they did was lab type of situation. But those companies grew so quickly that they weren't able to keep up with the staff and the support. So when I would say when you're looking at a project and you're looking at bringing out this team, yes, you want to make sure that they've done some labs before, but you really want to understand who the project manager is or the architect that you're going to be getting from those individuals to understand what their experience is and what they've done previously in terms of just running that project. And really making sure that you jive with them. Like I said, you're going to be working with this person for the next year and a half very closely. And it's a very important aspect in terms of just making sure that overall camaraderie is there. It's same as building your team internally. This person's going to be an extension of your team, or this group is going to be an extension of your team for the next year and a half. And even past that, if you grow out of that space, if you need to make modifications, you're going to still want to be able to work with them. And so looking at it from that light, making sure that you're understanding what the experience is, who you're getting, and that that you're going to be able to trust that individual in terms of when it comes to those heavy times in a project, that they're going to get you across the finish line and they're going to make sure they can take care of you is an absolute important piece of the puzzle that I can't speak highly enough in terms of that. I think the other aspect is just in terms of design from an architectural standpoint. There's different architects out there that have different design capabilities, or they look at projects in a different light. And so getting a feel for what those designers can do and what they bring to the table and just how they operate is definitely a big factor when it comes to what your space is going to actually feel like as you're operating in it. What's that flow? What is that the team feeling as you come into that space? And so those are just a couple of different factors that I would say when selecting the team you really want to be cautious of, and you want to make sure you dig into it deeply and don't just go take somebody that recommended somebody else instantly, right? So you want to look at it, you want to get out there, and you want to have a good feeling about who that team is, and you definitely want to look around a little bit just to make sure you've covered all your bases.
Yeah, just add to, I think it's really good advice. So at MBI, we've managed 3 construction projects in 3 years, and can't wait for July 4th to come, because that's when we're supposed to be done with the last one. But I wouldn't, as you think about your construction and your architectural team, like I wouldn't hire a brand. You want to actually hire the actual executives that are going to be on your project, because you can have very different experiences with the same contractor, same architect on 2 different jobs. You can have very, very different experiences based on the actual project team that gets assigned to you. So just pay particular attention to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to add to that as well, I mean, we got lucky because we actually had to find them on a cleared list, before doing anything. So for us, it's really about making sure that they can walk the walk and talk the talk. Because of what we're doing is so specialized and so niche. They had to understand some of the parameters, actually many of the parameters that are required from, so essentially they had 3 customers, me, their internal team, and the government, right? So they had to be specific and really follow a specific path that all of us laid out together, because we had to work collaboratively to make sure that the job gets done, right? So for us, we looked for a lot of the competence, we looked for a lot of the know-how, the industry knowledge, as well as making sure that they're not on a terror list, right? So, but essentially just making sure that that we had the confidence that they were going to carry and execute on our vision.
And just another factor that I thought of is you don't always want to operate off of cost. I know budget is always a big factor in there, and if you go out and get 3 different proposals or RFPs, don't just go out and pick the least expensive one, right? You want to think about it. You really want to look at that team, and you want to make your selection appropriately. Sometimes you might need to pick the least cost-effective option, but just really think through that process before you make those decisions, because it's a very important piece of making sure your space gets done appropriately and on time.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I will ask one more. Does anyone have any last words of advice for folks who are maybe thinking it's about time to start thinking about next steps?
Yeah, sure. So ask everyone and anyone that you know in your network, in the industry, people you're passing in a hallway, if they've gone through this process before, what they thought about it. Get all of the information you can, because if you're not collecting that information, it's going to be that much harder for you as you make these decisions to move out and you get into your new space. So if you can talk to everybody, specifically incubators, right? You're with all of these other companies in there. 9 times out of 10, somebody else has gone through this process before. So have those conversations and get a feel for that. They're going to have recommendations for you that you can trust and you can lean on, and you can vet yourself. And so, I know it's kind of a generic answer, but really just have those conversations when you're thinking about that process, and talk to people to see, where to go, what to do next, what's the next big thing, and, was there something they would have done differently if they had done it previously, and how can you improve on that for when you're going through this process?
Yeah, no. I at least one parting thought that I have is that a lot of incubators they aggregate all these resources for you. What I wish I did was that I wish I talked to all of those resources to look at their supply chain, or how they are able to support startups or growing companies that leave the space, right? Do they actually do it, or do they have a locked-in contract with the incubators? We found some that did have lock-in contracts where they couldn't really extend themselves outside of that. And we were like, well, okay, well, ass out of hand, so we had to find somebody else, right? So I would say, you know what, before you think about even leaving or even just planning on expansion, just kind of talk to those resources to see how they can help you with your growth goals, right? And it can help really clarify and provide some context as far as, you know what, this is what I'm actually going to need throughout my journey, throughout my startup's journey, whether it's here or whether it's elsewhere. They can at least follow me.
Yeah, I mean, largely, I think it's already been said a lot today, but the biggest advice we give all startups is just it all comes down to team, and building out your team on the scientific front, on the construction front, on your as you continue to scale and grow, that's going to be the biggest determination between success and failure at each given stage. So take each of these personnel decisions personally. Think about the impact that they're going to have on your startup, and make sure that you're making all those decisions very intentionally to manage your growth going forward. So, just protect your culture and protect your team, fiercely, and make sure you have the right people around you to manage each part of that success.
Great, thanks. If no other questions, I'll wrap up. So just wanted to thank everybody for coming. We hope to see you at the next MassBio event. I have a quick rundown of the upcoming events. So MassBio, as well as John and the MBI team, will be at the Worcester Regional Mixer at Redemption Rock Brewing on May 25th. MassBio is also hosting the community concert at Bio, which is featuring the Chainsmokers. That's at Big Night Live on June 6th. Waltham Regional Mixer is going to take place at the Craft Food Hall Project on June 15th. And then finally, the next MassBio Forum on understanding the market impact on the biotech pipeline is happening on June 26th. Thanks, everybody. Across the hall, we'll be having the vendor showcase, and there's also food and networking. So thanks so much.
Thank you.